from a global superpower.
Just the usual Russian disdain, the usual Russian arrogance.
Now a vassal of China.
Today, Russia is handing over part of its sovereignty to China.
Its weight on the world stage is fading.
Russia has always thrived on conflict.
The South Caucasus, the Middle East, Central Asia, Africa. Russia spread its tentacles into these regions, fueling wars, supporting coups, blackmailing the world with flows of migrants, forcing others to reckon with it. Now Kremlin's authority is weakening. Why Moscow's saber-rattling no longer impresses anyone. Watch in the special report, From Fear to Irrelevance, the Decline of Kremlin Power. July 1st, 2025, Kajibadeli, Azerbaijan. Dozens of people came to say goodbye to Ziauddin and Hussein Safarov. It was their deaths that marked the beginning of a new cooling in relations between Russia and Azerbaijan. 3 days earlier, the Safarov brothers and about 50 other members of the diaspora had been detained by Russian security forces in Yekaterinburg. They were brutally beaten and tortured. And to cover up the crime, the cause of death of one of the brothers was officially listed as heart failure. But Azerbaijani forensic experts confirmed that the men had been tortured.
During the subsequent examination, we discovered multiple fractures on Ziauddin's body, resulting from beatings. All of his ribs were broken, and he had a head hemorrhage caused by blunt force trauma. The other brother, Hussein, also died from beatings. After the skull was open, hemorrhages were found in the brain tissue. The blunt chest trauma was accompanied by multiple displaced rib fractures on both sides along several anatomical lines. There were about 7 to 8 displaced rib fractures on each side.
The particular cynicism, according to Azerbaijan's Ministry of Health, Russian pathologists removed all internal organs from one of the brothers to hide the true cause of death. In response, Azerbaijan's authorities cancelled the Russian Deputy Prime Minister's visit to Baku, the parliamentary delegation's trip to Moscow, as well as all cultural events connected to Russians.
Taking into account the demonstrative, deliberate, and extrajudicial killings and acts of violence committed by Russian law enforcement against Azerbaijanis, all cultural events between Azerbaijan and Russia are hereby cancelled, from the statement of the Ministry of Culture of Azerbaijan.
In addition, Azerbaijani police carried out a special operation at the local propaganda outlet Sputnik Azerbaijan and detained 2 Kremlin agitators, identified as FSB officers.
The fact that Sputnik, like Rossotrodnichestvo, is nothing but a cover site for Russian intelligence officers and agents is known to anyone who has ever dealt with such structures or studied the history of Soviet and Putin-era Russian espionage and sabotage. What is unprecedented is not that Russian intelligence officers worked at Sputnik, but that they were detained in the capital of a former Soviet republic. And this reflects the growing level of tension in Azerbaijani-Russian relations.
This is not the first case of relations cooling between Moscow and Baku. The current crisis dates back to the crash of an Azerbaijani airliner near Aktau airport in Kazakhstan last December. The passenger plane was shot down by Russian air defense.
The Embraer 190 of AZAL Airlines, which crashed in Kazakhstan while operating a flight from Baku to Grozny, was, according to preliminary findings, subjected to external physical and technical interference.
The version that the AZAL aircraft was brought down by Russian air defense is beyond doubt. Earlier, the political and information portal Caliber.as, citing government sources, identified a Russian missile as the cause of the catastrophe.
Russia has still not admitted guilt for downing the plane. Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev demanded that Moscow punish those responsible and compensate the victims, later accusing the Kremlin of trying to cover up the incident.
This is ordinary Russian contempt, ordinary Russian arrogance, ordinary Russian, almost racist conviction that the President of Russia, with his Russian boot, stands higher than the leader of any former Soviet republic, any European country. Because the Russian boot has once trampled there, and if it failed to stay, then the people who once lived under that boot are naturally not considered people.
Yet, in intercepted conversations of Russian military, one can clearly hear the command to open fire on a civilian aircraft.
Да, дальность уже 7. Огонь! Огонь, говорю!
Now, Azerbaijan is preparing to file a case against Russia in international court for the downing of the airliner, and the country's president voiced his support for Ukraine, urging never to accept occupation.
Never accept occupation. That is the main lesson. That is what we ourselves did.
For these words, the Kremlin, through the voices of its propagandists, threatened Azerbaijan with war. Similar rhetoric had earlier been directed toward neighbouring Armenia, Moscow's longtime partner in the region. In response to Yerevan suspending its CSTO membership, Russian propagandists, under Kremlin orders, showered Armenia with aggressive statements.
With the state of Armenia, with the people who live in Armenia, we will have to part ways. And every person who voted for Pashinyan bears responsibility together with him. They must understand that before my children even finish school, the state of Armenia will remain only in history. And if the people of Armenia are fine with that, well, then they deserved it.
For context, Russian propagandist Margarita Simonian is ethnically Armenian, yet she wishes her historical homeland to disappear to please the Putin regime.
It is impossible to build equal relations with those who do not even recognize you as a country. They cannot perceive Armenia or Azerbaijan as states. For them, these are some kind of geopolitical accidents born out of what they call the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, as said by their, I will refrain from harsher words, their president, leader, whatever he is, in short, the head of the criminal gang that seized power in Russia.
The first signs of tension in Russian-Armenian relations can probably be traced back to the end of the Nagorno-Karabakh War. In September 2023, Azerbaijan forced the self-proclaimed Karabakh authorities to capitulate. Armenia, unlike in the two previous wars over the region, did not intervene. And Russia, which was supposed to guarantee the security of Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh,
Russia positioned itself as a mediator in the settlement of the conflict. But the problem is that Russia itself was both the architect of this conflict and its arsonist, the beneficiary of this conflict. Its mediation was nothing but a smokescreen to disguise its real intentions. At this point, it sounds almost anecdotal to ask whose side Russia was on in the Armenian-Azerbaijani conflict. The answer is clear. Russia was on the side of the conflict itself.
By fueling tensions between the two states, the Kremlin could keep them within its sphere of influence. Without that leverage, Russia suddenly became unnecessary to both.
Our region is trapped between two major wars. To the north, the war Russia unleashed against Ukraine, and to the south, the boiling cauldron of the Middle East. In these conditions, both Armenia and Azerbaijan began reassessing and revising their approaches, at least recognizing the fact that we share a border stretching over 1,000 kilometers, and that vital transit routes pass through our countries, linking two continents, Europe and Asia. On this basis, the first prerequisites for common interests began to emerge.
And now, all Moscow can do is rattle its weapons and unleash its foul-mouthed propagandists. But they no longer inspire fear. The blitzkrieg on Kyiv and the bravado about 3 days turned into more than 3 years of a bloody war, where Russia loses 1,000 men every single day and is forced to beg before petty dictators in search of resources, to plead with North Korea for fighters to retake its own territory.
Russia is objectively weakening. Without assistance from the East, it cannot sustain the fight. It is critically dependent on Iranian components for its Shahed drone.
But at critical moments, Russia abandons its allies to their fate, just as it did with Iran in its confrontation with Israel and the United States.
Iranian regime, Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror. Tonight, I can report to the world.
To this day, there is no consensus on whether American bombs fully ended Iran's nuclear program. But one thing is clear: they signaled the definitive collapse of Russia's authority in the Middle East. Moscow tried to use the conflict as its trump card, to act as a mediator, and thus regain international influence. But when it came to serious decisions, Russia was simply excluded from the table.
Putin, by the way, was speaking not only with Trump, but also with Netanyahu and Pezeshkian. They hoped to secure mediator status, which would have given them a chance not to end up in the situation they face now.
Russia. As you know, Vladimir called me up. He said, "Can I help you with Iran?" I said, "No, I don't need help with Iran. I need help with you. And I hope we're going to be getting a deal."
And in fact, Trump's phrase, "I need help with you," put an end to all these efforts, because Russia had counted on exploiting Iran for its own interests.
And Moscow was never going to fight the United States for Iran, even though Tehran supplied Russia with drones, helped build the Shahed factory, and transferred ballistic missiles. In return, the Kremlin promised support and shared technology for Iran's nuclear program.
In the eyes of Iranians, they are traitors. At one time, Russia refused to deliver Su-35s, even though Iranian pilots had completed full training. They had likely even purchased simulators, ground-based Su-35 trainers. Iranians also tried to buy additional air defense systems, but were denied. In Iran, they are seen as a party that betrays Iranian interests, not only with the US, but also with Israel.
Russia stubbornly tried to play its geopolitical solitaire, but in the end lost its reputation.
Now, this will certainly affect bilateral relations. In the midst of a crisis in Russian-Azerbaijani ties, Iran's president traveled to a summit in Azerbaijan. Moscow did not take kindly to this meeting. I believe most of the projects Russia counted on, particularly its mega-project North-South Transport Corridor, linking Russia to the Indian Ocean through Iranian ports on the Arabian Sea, will collapse, and Iran will fully reorient its arms purchases toward China.
Russia had demonstrated its toothlessness even earlier, in the Middle East, in Syria. On December 8, 2024, after nearly 14 years of war and 2 weeks of intense offensives, opposition forces of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham entered the Syrian capital, Damascus. This marked the end of Assad's dictatorial regime. The tyrant himself fled with his family, fearing retribution for his crimes against the people. Tellingly, the former dictator escaped to Russia, to his old ally.
Accordingly, since the beginning of the civil war in 2011, Russia had supported Syria together with Iran, signing agreements to extend the stay of its bases in Tartus and Latakia, its naval and air force footholds.
Russian propagandists branded the opposition as terrorists and promised Assad to fight them. But on the day of reckoning, Moscow revealed its impotence.
The only real success Russia could claim was evacuating Bashar al-Assad to Moscow, sparing the dictator from a fair trial. Beyond that, nothing. Russia was in no shape, militarily, politically, or technically, to counter the influence of Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, or the rebels, who advanced quickly and decisively. All it managed was to hold on to one ally while losing control of the bigger picture.
Moreover, the Kremlin swiftly changed its rhetoric, and in the mouths of propagandists and the Kremlin boss, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham turned from terrorists and criminals into the respected opposition in a desperate bid to retain Russian bases in Syria.
Russia has lost its last stronghold in the Middle East. The only question now is how soon it will be forced to abandon its naval and air bases. In other words, we must acknowledge the fact Russia has no future in Syria. Whether it wants to or not, the Kremlin has nothing to offer, diplomatically, economically, or otherwise. Syria today is surrounded by far more serious partners: Turkey, Qatar, and other Arab states that leave Russia sidelined and irrelevant.
The Syrian authorities are already severing ties with Russia. For example, control over the strategic port of Tartus was handed over to the United Arab Emirates, taken out of Russian hands.
No strength, no capacity, no resources. And much of Russia's image turned out to be nothing but a television picture broadcast. Their main task was to make the region believe in that picture. Now they are scrambling to minimize the damage of their Syrian defeat, still trying to present themselves as a strong player. But this image is collapsing quickly.
Even on distant continents, Russia is losing ground. Its influence in Africa, especially in the Sahel region, is crumbling.
The Russian Federation is facing an increasingly visible loss of influence in the Sahel, despite actively transferring heavy weaponry and attempting to strengthen its military presence through the newly created African Corps. From a statement by the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine.
In June this year, Moscow announced the withdrawal of former Wagner fighters from Mali, claiming they had completed their mission by stabilizing the region and restoring power to the legitimate authorities.
Claims of a supposedly successful completion of the mission by the Wagner Group in Mali stand in sharp contrast with the reality on the ground. The security situation continues to deteriorate. On the very day the withdrawal was announced, Malian government forces suffered heavy losses. Most notably, they lost control of the strategic Bulksi military camp. From a statement by the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine.
This failure stems not so much from a lack of resources as from sheer Kremlin greed. The world first heard of the Wagnerites because of their operations in Africa. It was a private military company run by Yevgeny Prigozhin, a close ally of Putin. But in June 2023, he launched his march on Moscow against the leadership of Russia's defense ministry. The Kremlin labeled it a mutiny, and soon after, Prigozhin, conveniently for Putin, died in a plane crash. The PMC was then taken over by the Ministry of Defense.
The thing is, when you are a private military company with resources, you share them with a vast number of local actors, which gives you freedom to operate as you wish. But once greed takes over, that system collapses. Gradually, local actors start questioning, what are you doing here? Who gave you this right? Previously, you could simply say, how many fighters do you need to take power in Mali, for example? 5,000? No problem, we'll send 5,000. But if now you can no longer field those bayonets, then who needs you?
Today, Russia itself has become dependent on resources, particularly from China.
Russia is essentially turning into a satellite, a proxy force of China. And I don't believe that in 2022, when Putin began this reckless adventure, he foresaw such an outcome. At this moment, Russia is losing part of its sovereignty to China. It is the Chinese who will increasingly define Russian policy. In this sense, I think the Russian elites, and Putin personally, have already resigned themselves to this reality.
And as states free themselves from Russian influence, they are building new alliances, where there is no place for Russia.
The first case that proved extremely painful for the Kremlin was Uzbekistan between 2012 and 2017. But today, Uzbekistan can hardly be seen as a country following in the footsteps of Vladimir Putin's victims. Uzbekistan's primary partner is now the People's Republic of China. The next step was Kazakhstan. Let us recall 2022, the CSTO troop deployment, and so on. It seemed like Russia had entrenched itself. But after signals from China and Turkey, the CSTO pulled out. Now, developments in Kyrgyzstan are moving in the same direction, away from Russia's grip. Tajikistan as well.
Russia is rapidly losing influence in regions it once considered its domain. One by one, allies turn their backs on the Kremlin, disgusted by its betrayal, arrogance, and military impotence.
Putin is absolutely convinced. We are Russia, and everything is permitted to us. But no, it isn't. Not because of some other force, but because against every power, there will always be another. He should not have tried to smash his head against the wall, especially when that wall was already rotten. And who showed this most clearly? Ukraine. Without Ukraine, the balance of power would look very different.
By unleashing war against Ukraine, Putin never imagined that it would be on Ukrainian soil that Russian power would be buried, along with its great power delusions and imperial ambitions. In Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, the Caucasus, where once Russia dominated, fear of it is gone. Allies are weary of humiliation and betrayal. Enemies no longer take it into account. This is no longer an empire of influence, but a Chinese vassal. The terms are now dictated by other players, while Putin merely tries to save face, begging for soldiers and resources to fuel his war around the world in exchange for the remnants of Russian sovereignty. Senior Barvinenko, Special Report.